The sound of guitars and laughter echoed through the hot Nashville night, but I could barely hear it over the pounding in my ears. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I sat parked outside the club. I saw them. Laura, my wife of 8 years, stood leaning against Adam Bryan, her old high school friend, now a country music star. The way she smiled at him, the way he touched her, my gut twisted in knots. It was like watching a stranger. She wasn't the woman I married. It all started 2 weeks ago. Laura left the house one morning, heading to work as usual. Nothing was out of the ordinary. I kissed her goodbye and told her I'd see her for dinner. But dinner came and went, and Laura never returned. Calls went unanswered, and I started to fear the worst. I'm a detective, after all. My mind immediately went to crime scenes, accidents, kidnappings. But on the third day, I finally got a call. "I'm in Nashville, John," her voice said over the line, casual like everything was fine. "I have things to do here." My heart sank. "Nashville? Why? What kind of things?" "I'll be back soon," she added, ignoring my question. "Don't worry." But how could I not worry? Something was wrong. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. A quick check of her bank accounts showed multiple purchases in Nashville, festival tickets, hotel stays, things she had no reason to be buying. Laura never liked country music. Then I remembered Adam Bryan. He and Laura were close in high school, inseparable back then. And now he was a rising star in the country music scene. I hadn't thought about him in years, but I knew where this was going. I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe I was overreacting, but the gnawing suspicion only grew. She wasn't just in Nashville for business, she was there to see him. That's when I made my decision. I had to go to Nashville, to see it with my own eyes. The drive was long and filled with doubt. I thought about the woman I married, the woman who had been my partner. My confidant. We had built a life together in Falls Church, Virginia. But now, she was with another man, rekindling something that should have been long buried. When I arrived in Nashville, the festival was in full swing. Thousands of people filled the streets, drunk on music and liquor. I blended into the crowd, my detective instincts taking over. I kept my head down and my eyes sharp. It didn't take long to find them. There, in the middle of it all, was Laura. She was laughing, her hand resting on Adam's arm like she was the happiest woman in the world. I hadn't seen her smile like that in years. I felt sick. She looked alive, more alive than she'd ever been with me. Adam was playing the crowd, strumming his guitar, singing his heart out, and Laura watched him like he was the only person that mattered. I moved closer, staying in the shadows, and then I heard it, her voice, low but clear enough to slice through me. "I feel so alive with you," she told Adam. "I could never feel this way with John." My heart stopped. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My suspicions were confirmed, and it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I had been right. They were more than friends. They were lovers. I didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, I turned and walked back to my car, my mind racing. Fury, betrayal, and humiliation all swirled inside me, and I wanted them to feel every bit of it. They had taken everything from me, my marriage, my dignity, my life. I wasn't just going to sit back and let it happen. As I sat in my car, staring at the neon lights of the club, an idea formed. I was going to make them pay. Not just them, but everyone at that festival. I knew exactly what to do. They thought they could play me for a fool. They thought they could humiliate me. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. It was time to show them. 2 weeks earlier, I had no idea my life was about to fall apart. I stood in our kitchen, coffee in hand, as Laura grabbed her purse and headed out the door. "See you tonight," she said with a smile that felt just a little too perfect. I didn't think much of it at the time. Just another ordinary morning in Falls Church, Virginia. That night, when she didn't come home, I was more confused than concerned. I figured maybe work ran late or she stopped by a friend's. But by midnight, I was pacing. I called her phone 5, 10, 20 times, nothing. No response, no explanation. By the third day of silence, I was going out of my mind. Then, her call finally came. "I'm in Nashville," she said, as if she was talking about a casual weekend getaway. Just needed to get away for a bit. Nashville. That was the first sign. What would Laura be doing there? She hated country music. The only thing she hated more than twangy guitars was crowds, and Nashville had both. Still, I tried to be rational. Maybe it was work-related. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But as a detective, I knew one thing: trust your instincts. I started digging. Nothing too intrusive at first, just checking her recent transactions. She'd been buying things in Nashville. Alright, concert tickets, a hotel room, restaurants, all things that didn't add up to a work trip. And then I saw it, the festival tickets. She wasn't there on business. She was there for fun. That's when I remembered Adam Bryan. Adam had always been a point of tension between us. Laura had mentioned him a few times early in our relationship, the way old flames come up in conversation. Just a friend from high school, she'd say. But something in her tone always felt off. Too dismissive, too casual. And now, seeing her spending time in Nashville, home of country music and Adam's rising stardom, the pieces started falling into place. I had to confirm it. I packed a bag, told my boss I was taking time off, and got in the car. The drive to Nashville was excruciating. My mind played every possible scenario on repeat, each one worse than the last. By the time I arrived, my nerves were shot, and I was running on nothing but coffee and adrenaline. Finding her wasn't hard. I knew exactly where to look, the festival. When I saw them together, it was like a punch in the gut. There was no denying it now. Laura wasn't just here for the music. She was here for him. For Adam. The two of them were inseparable. She looked at him the way she used to look at me, and it made my blood boil. I watched them for hours that night, hidden in the shadows, taking in every detail. Her laugh, his touch, the way they seemed to exist in a world where I didn't matter. By the end of the night, I knew what I had to do. Revenge was never something I had considered before. But in that moment, it felt like the only option. They had humiliated me, torn apart everything I thought was real. And I wasn't going to let it go without a fight. Back at my hotel, I made some calls. Nashville is the kind of town where people don't ask too many questions if you've got enough cash. I found a guy who worked in the catering team at the festival and told him what I needed. Just a little something extra added to the drinks at the after party. Nothing lethal, just enough to ruin their night. Enough to make them suffer. It didn't take much convincing. Money talks, and in a city full of tourists, it's easy to slip something into the mix without anyone noticing. The next day, everything was set. Laura and Adam were going to the after party. They'd laugh, drink, dance, until the poison kicked in. I would be there, watching, waiting for the moment when they realized something was wrong. It wasn't about getting them arrested. That would be too easy, too clean. No, I wanted them to experience the pain I'd felt. The betrayal, the confusion. I wanted them to look at each other and see their own failure, their own recklessness. I sat in the club that night, drink in hand, as the music blared and the crowd buzzed. Laura and Adam were at the center of it all, basking in the attention. They had no idea what was coming. As the night wore on, the first signs began to show. People started feeling sick, clutching their stomachs, heading for the bathrooms in a panic. Laura stumbled, leaning against Adam. Her face pale. My heart raced. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I followed them outside, watching as they struggled to stay on their feet. A crowd had gathered, confused and frightened. Someone called an ambulance, and within minutes, they were being loaded onto stretchers. Laura looked up at me from where she lay, barely conscious, her eyes wide with fear. "John," she whispered, her voice weak. "What's happening?" I crouched down beside her, just close enough for her to hear me. "Now you know how it feels," I said softly. As the ambulance doors closed, taking her and Adam away, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. They thought they could betray me and destroy our life together. But I wasn't the one who was going to end up broken. I was just getting started. The cold fluorescent lights of the hospital flickered above me as I walked through the emergency room doors. The chaos from the festival had followed Laura and Adam here, along with the rest of the sick. The air smelled of antiseptic and panic. Nurses rushed past with clipboards, doctors shouted orders, and the waiting room buzzed with the low hum of anxiety. I stood there, calm, in the eye of the storm. I knew exactly why I was here. Laura and Adam had been taken to the ICU, along with dozens of others who had fallen ill at the after party. The poison had worked. I had timed everything perfectly. It was a mild toxin, nothing that would kill, but enough to make them suffer, to bring them to their knees. Enough to show them who was really in control. As I approached the nurse's station, a young woman in scrubs looked up at me, her face lined with exhaustion. "Can I help you?" she asked, barely glancing away from her monitor. "I'm here for my wife." "Laura Harrison," I said, my voice steady. "She was brought in from the festival earlier tonight." The nurse typed something into her computer, her fingers moving swiftly across the keys. "She's in ICU," she said, then paused. "Are you her husband?" Yes. The word left my mouth before I had a chance to think about it. Husband. How strange that title felt now, after everything that had happened. I wasn't sure what we were anymore, certainly not the couple we used to be. But I still wore the ring, and technically, it was the truth. The nurse motioned down the hallway. "Room 302. You can see her, but the doctor will be in shortly." I nodded and walked away, my mind buzzing with anticipation. I could feel the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The remnants of what I had set in motion earlier that night. This was the final step, the confrontation. The moment I would let her know exactly what she had done, and exactly what I had done in return. I pushed open the door to room 302, and there she was. Laura lay on the hospital bed, her face pale against the white sheets. Her eyes were closed, and an IV ran into her arm. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence, a steady reminder of her fragility. For a moment, I just stood there, staring. This was the woman I had built a life with. The woman I had loved, shared a home with and planned a future with. But as I looked at her now, all I could feel was the cold void of betrayal. She had thrown it all away for him. I took a seat beside her bed, the chair creaking under my weight. My fingers drummed lightly on the armrest as I waited. Part of me hoped she would wake up on her own, so I wouldn't have to break the silence first. But after a few minutes, her eyes fluttered open. "John?" Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. She blinked a few times, trying to focus on me. What happened?" I leaned forward, my hands clasped together. "You got sick at the festival. They brought you here. You're going to be okay." My words were measured and calm. I wanted her to understand what was coming. Laura winced, her hand moving to her stomach. "I don't understand. 1 minute everything was fine, and then..." She trailed off, confusion clouding her face. I let the silence hang for a moment before I spoke again. "You don't understand, do you? You have no idea what's really going on." She looked at me, her brow furrowed. "John, what are you talking about?" I stood up, pacing the room, letting my frustration spill out in measured steps. "I know about you and Adam. I know why you've been in Nashville. I saw you. I watched you, Laura. You and him. You didn't even try to hide it." Her face drained of what little color it had left. "John, it's not what you think. Don't lie to me." My voice cracked with the weight of my rage. "I heard you. I saw everything. You couldn't even be bothered to pretend anymore." Tears welled in her eyes, but I couldn't stop now. "You took everything from me," I continued, my voice low but sharp. "Our marriage, our life together, it's all gone. For what? For him? For some washed-up musician?" Laura reached out a trembling hand, but I stepped back, out of her reach. "John, please," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It just did." "That's not good enough," I said, shaking my head. "You made your choice, Laura. And now, you're going to live with it." She stared at me, her lips quivering. "What do you mean?" I leaned in closer, so she could hear every word clearly. "You think you're here because of some random food poisoning? No, Laura. You're here because I put you here. I poisoned you and everyone at that party." Her eyes widened in horror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "John, no, you didn't." "Yes, I did," I said, coldly. "I wanted you to feel what I felt. Betrayed. Powerless. You and Adam thought you could play me for a fool, but I was always 2 steps ahead." The tears streamed down her face now, and she covered her mouth with her hand as if trying to hold back the sobs. "John, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." I stood there, watching her crumble. For a brief moment, I felt something close to satisfaction. This was what she deserved. She had torn our life apart. And now she was paying the price. But as I looked at her, broken and scared, a strange emptiness settled in my chest. The revenge that had consumed me for weeks, the plan I had so carefully constructed, it all felt hollow now. I had won, but at what cost? Everything I had once loved was gone, and there was no getting it back. I turned away from her, the cold hospital room feeling even more suffocating than before. "I'll talk to the doctors," I muttered. "They'll take care of you. But we're done. Laura, this is over." Without waiting for a response, I walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind me. And just like that, everything we had was gone. I walked out of that hospital room, leaving Laura behind, but the weight of what I'd done followed me into the night. The cold Nashville air bit at my skin as I stood outside, looking up at the black sky, the distant hum of sirens and city life, a dull reminder that the world kept turning, even after everything had fallen apart. What had I expected? That walking away from her would give me some kind of peace? That seeing the fear and regret in her eyes would make me feel whole again? But as I stood there, I realized something: it didn't. There was no satisfaction, no release from the rage and betrayal that had consumed me for weeks. The void in my chest was still there, and it had only grown darker. I had destroyed everything, not just my marriage but myself. I wasn't the same man who had kissed his wife goodbye 2 weeks ago. That man was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. A man capable of poisoning dozens of strangers just to make his wife suffer. The revenge, the anger, it all felt empty now. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, a message from my boss back in Falls Church. "John, we need to talk. There's an issue with a case. Call me." I shoved the phone back into my pocket, ignoring it. There were bigger issues now. Laura was still in the hospital. And Adam Bryan, the man she had thrown everything away for, was lying in the room next to hers, just as sick. I couldn't bring myself to see him, though. As much as I hated him, seeing Adam would only remind me of what I had lost. What I had ruined with my own hands. But the fallout was coming, and I knew it. Word would get out about the poisoning at the festival, and it wouldn't take long before questions were asked. People would start looking for answers, and eventually, they'd find their way back to me. I wasn't stupid. I had planned everything carefully, and covered my tracks, but nothing stays hidden forever. And deep down, a part of me wondered if I even cared anymore. Maybe this was the punishment I deserved. I lit a cigarette and leaned against my car, watching the smoke curl up into the night sky. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire career chasing down criminals, bringing them to justice, and now, I was the one on the other side. A detective turned criminal, a man undone by his own thirst for revenge. The door to the hospital slid open, and I saw a familiar face walking toward me, Detective Sarah Connolly. She was from the Nashville PD, a hard-edged woman with a reputation for getting to the truth. I hadn't expected to see her so soon, but I knew why she was there. She wasn't the type to waste time. "John," she said, her tone cool but professional. "We need to talk." I took a final drag of my cigarette, tossing it to the ground. "What about?" "You know what about," she replied, stepping closer. "The festival, the mass poisoning. We've got people in critical condition, and we're running out of leads." I kept my expression neutral, though my heart raced. "And what does that have to do with me?" Connolly's eyes narrowed. "You were at the festival, John. I've got witnesses who saw you. And you're a detective from out of town. That makes you interesting." "I was there to see my wife," I said calmly. "She's one of the victims, in case you didn't notice." "I noticed," she said, crossing her arms. "But there's something off about this whole thing. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not. But you've got some explaining to do." I stared at her, weighing my options. I could lie, deny everything, or I could face the consequences. Either way, this was far from over. "Come on," she said, motioning toward her car. "Let's talk down at the station." I didn't resist. I knew this moment was coming. The fallout had begun. The interrogation room was colder than I remembered from the other side. I'd been in plenty of these rooms before, but always as the one asking questions, not the one sitting in the hot seat. The metal chair beneath me creaked as I shifted, trying to get comfortable. Across from me, Detective Connolly sat with her arms folded, a file open in front of her. She hadn't said much since we arrived, but I could feel her studying me, waiting for me to crack. "John," she began finally, breaking the silence, "I'm going to be straight with you. I know something's not right here. I've got witnesses placing you at the festival, hovering around the bar before the drinks were spiked. I've got surveillance footage of you entering the party, looking suspicious. You want to tell me what's really going on?" I met her gaze, my mind spinning. Part of me wanted to keep up the charade, to lie my way out of this like I had lied to myself for weeks. But what was the point? What had all this scheming and revenge really gotten me? Laura was in a hospital bed, Adam was next door, and I was sitting in an interrogation room, about to lose everything. I took a deep breath. "I did it." Connolly blinked, surprised by the sudden confession. "You did what?" "I poisoned the drinks," I said, my voice hollow. "At the festival. The after party. It was me." She stared at me, her expression unreadable. "Why? Why the hell would you do something like that?" Because I wanted to make them pay. The words felt heavy on my tongue, but I couldn't stop now. Laura, my wife, she was having an affair with Adam Bryan. They were at that party together, flaunting it right in front of me. I wanted them to feel what I felt. The betrayal, the pain. So, I did it. I spiked the drinks. Connolly leaned back in her chair, processing what I'd just admitted. Jesus, John, you realize what you've done, right? This isn't just about your wife and her affair. Dozens of people were poisoned. Some of them might not make it. I know, I muttered, burying my face in my hands. The weight of it all was crashing down on me now. The enormity of what I'd done. I know. For a moment, the room was silent. Connolly tapped her pen against the table, her mind working through the implications of my confession. Finally, she spoke. We're going to have to charge you. You know that, right? I nodded. There was no point in fighting it anymore. I know. I'll need a full statement, she said, standing up. And then we'll book you. As she left the room to prepare the paperwork, I sat there, staring at the table, the enormity of my actions sinking in. My career, my marriage, my life, everything was over. And for what? A moment of revenge that had destroyed far more than it had fixed. Laura would recover, and so would Adam. But I was the one left broken, the one who had truly lost everything. The next hours blurred together. I was processed, fingerprinted, and locked in a holding cell. My mind kept cycling through the same thoughts, what I'd done, how I'd ended up here, and the broken mess of my life. I tried to focus, but the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead and the low hum of voices from the other cells kept pulling me back to the present reality. I was under arrest, and my life as I knew it was over. The cell was cold, its concrete walls trapping the chill. I sat on the narrow bench, my back against the wall, staring at the floor. The hard truth was sinking in. I'd crossed a line, one you can't uncross. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the villain. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. I looked up to see Detective Connolly approaching, a clipboard in hand. She didn't look at me with pity or disgust, just that same professional detachment she'd had since the beginning. I appreciated that. No judgment, just business. You'll be arraigned tomorrow, she said, leaning against the bars. They're going to charge you with felony assault and reckless endangerment. Multiple counts. Your wife and Adam. They're pressing charges, too. Attempted manslaughter might get added depending on what the DA decides. I nodded, not saying a word. There was no use in pleading my case. I'd already confessed, and the evidence was stacked against me. This wasn't a mystery I could solve or a case I could manipulate. I was the guilty one, and I'd have to face the consequences. Connolly shifted, glancing at her clipboard. I've seen a lot of cases like this, you know. Spouses get revenge, and people do things they regret because of betrayal. But this? You took it to a whole other level. You didn't just hurt them, you endangered a lot of innocent people. People who had nothing to do with your marriage. Her words hit hard, and I felt a sinking pit in my stomach. I'd been so blinded by my own anger, my need for revenge, that I hadn't thought about the collateral damage. Strangers, innocent festival goers, had ended up in the hospital because of me. People who had no idea who I was or what my wife had done to me. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now they were suffering because of my choices. Why did you do it, John? Connolly asked after a pause. I get that you were angry, that you felt betrayed. But why go that far? I looked at her, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. Because I didn't know how to stop. I felt like everything was slipping away, like I was losing control of my life. And the more I thought about it, the more it consumed me. I wanted them to pay. I wanted them to hurt the way I was hurting. But I didn't think about what it would really cost. Not until it was too late. Connolly studied me for a moment, then nodded, as if she'd heard that story 100 times before. You'll get your day in court, she said, turning to leave. But whatever happens, John, you'll have to live with this for the rest of your life. As she walked away, I leaned back against the wall, letting her words sink in. The rest of my life, however long or short it might be, was going to be defined by this moment. By what I'd done in a blind rage. There was no undoing it now. The courtroom was colder than I expected, the polished wood and tall windows giving it an air of sterility, like it wasn't meant for human emotions, just legal facts. I sat at the defense table. My hands clasped tightly together, my lawyer sitting stiffly beside me. The judge hadn't arrived yet, but the room was already full. Reporters, onlookers, people I didn't know but who were eager to see the man who had poisoned a party full of strangers. The trial was bound to attract attention. A detective gone rogue, a poisoning at a high-profile festival, and a love triangle that had turned deadly. The media loved a scandal, and I had given them one. As I glanced around the room, I caught a glimpse of Laura. She sat with her lawyer, her face pale, her eyes avoiding mine. Adam wasn't with her, probably keeping his distance from the courtroom drama, but his absence only made the tension worse. Laura's eyes flicked over me once before quickly turning away, as if looking at me too long would break whatever composure she had left. The door opened, and the judge entered, bringing the room to a tense silence. I took a deep breath as the proceedings began, my heart pounding in my chest. The prosecution presented their case swiftly, outlining the charges against me: multiple counts of reckless endangerment, assault, and tampering with food and drink. It was all straightforward. I had confessed to everything, and now it was just a matter of sentencing. My lawyer stood to make his arguments, but it felt like an empty gesture. There was no defense that could justify what I had done. His plea for leniency based on emotional distress fell flat even to my ears. I wasn't some tragic figure undone by grief. I was a man who had lost control. And now, I had to face the consequences. The judge called for me to stand. My lawyer gestured for me to rise, and I felt every eye in the room on me as I did. This was it, the moment where I had to face everything I had destroyed. "Mr. Harrison," the judge said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "You stand before this court charged with multiple serious offenses. You have confessed to these crimes, and now you must face the consequences. Before I deliver my sentence, is there anything you wish to say?" I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. What could I possibly say to make any of this right? No words would undo the damage. But I knew I couldn't stay silent. My voice cracked, and I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. To the people at the festival, to the innocent bystanders who got caught up in this. I can't change what I've done, but I want them to know how deeply I regret it. I turned toward Laura, who sat stiff and still, her eyes locked on the table in front of her. And to my wife, I said, my voice shaking, "I'm sorry for how things ended. I let my anger destroy everything we had. I wasn't the man I should have been, and I'll have to live with that." There was no reaction from her, just the same cold distance that had settled between us since that night in Nashville. I had hoped for some kind of acknowledgement, some sign that she had heard me. But there was nothing. The judge nodded slightly, as if he had expected my words but wasn't moved by them. He cleared his throat and began delivering the sentence. "Given the severity of your crimes, and considering the impact on numerous innocent victims, this court sentences you to 10 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 6 years. You will also be required to pay restitution to the victims of the poisoning." The gavel struck the wood, a final, decisive sound that echoed through the room. Sealing my fate. I didn't resist as the bailiff led me out of the courtroom, the clinking of handcuffs sharp in my ears. 10 years. It was more than enough time to reflect on everything I had lost: my career, my wife, my life as I knew it. As the courtroom doors closed behind me, I glanced back one last time. Laura was already gone. Prison life hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the confinement or the loss of freedom. It was the silence in between, the long, empty stretches of time where all I had were my thoughts and regrets. The walls of my cell closed in on me, and the noise of the prison, clanging doors, shouting, guards barking orders, only added to the chaos inside my head. The first few weeks were the worst. I kept replaying everything: Laura's betrayal, Adam's smug face, and my own descent into madness. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just their fault. It was mine. I had let the rage consume me, had let it drive me to do something I could never take back. The other inmates quickly learned who I was. A former detective, a man who poisoned dozens of people out of spite. It didn't take long for word to spread. I wasn't sure how they'd react, if they'd see me as a threat or just another washed-up cop who'd lost everything. But I soon found out that most of them didn't care. They had their own problems to deal with. I was just another face in the crowd. I tried to keep my head down, to avoid drawing attention. But prison has its own rules, its own hierarchy, and it didn't take long for me to realize that I couldn't just fade into the background. One night, about a month in, I found myself cornered in the yard by a group of guys who clearly had something to prove. "You're the one who poisoned all those people, right?" one of them said, his voice low and threatening. He was tall, muscular, and covered in tattoos that seemed to tell their own violent story. "You think you're better than us, huh? Just because you were a cop?" I stood there, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not looking for trouble." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Too late for that, man. You should have thought about that before you messed with people's lives." I could see where this was going. They wanted to make an example out of me, to show the rest of the yard that even a former cop wasn't untouchable. But I wasn't about to go down without a fight. I'd already lost everything that mattered, and I wasn't about to let them take what little dignity I had left. The first punch came fast, a sharp blow to my ribs that knocked the wind out of me. I staggered back, trying to defend myself, but they were on me before I could react. Fists rained down, each hit more painful than the last, until I was on the ground, curled up, trying to protect my head. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. By the time the guards broke it up, I was bruised, bleeding, and barely conscious. They dragged me back to my cell, leaving me to nurse my wounds in silence. As I lay there on the cold, hard bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, I realized just how far I had fallen. I wasn't the man I used to be. I wasn't a detective, a protector, or a husband. I was just a broken shell, paying the price for my own stupidity. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. I learned to adapt, to survive. I kept to myself, avoiding trouble where I could. The world outside moved on without me. Laura had filed for divorce, something my lawyer delivered to me in a plain manila envelope. I signed the papers without even thinking, my hands shaking as I scribbled my name at the bottom of the form. That part of my life was over. Laura was gone, and I was left with nothing but time. It was early in my second year when the letter arrived. I wasn't expecting anything, no one wrote to me. My parents were gone, I had no siblings, and Laura, well, she had washed her hands of me long ago. But when the guards slid the envelope under my cell door, I picked it up with trembling hands, surprised by the sight of it. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in neat handwriting across the front. I hesitated for a moment before tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in half. I unfolded it slowly, my heart pounding as I read the words written in blue ink. "John, you don't know me, but I know what you did. I was at the festival. You poisoned me. You almost took my life. I've spent the last year trying to recover from what you did to me, and to the others. I can't forgive you for that. But I need you to understand something. You didn't just hurt yourself or your wife. You hurt dozens of people. Families, friends, strangers. We're all still picking up the pieces, and some of us may never fully heal. You made a choice, and that choice rippled out further than you could ever imagine. I hope you think about that every single day." A survivor. I sat there for a long time, the letter clutched in my hands, my vision blurring as the weight of the words sank in. A survivor. One of the people I had poisoned. One of the innocents who had paid the price for my rage. For my inability to control my emotions. I had spent so long thinking about Laura, about Adam, about my own pain, that I had never truly considered what I had done to the others. The people who were just there to enjoy a concert, who had no idea they were drinking poison because of some petty, vindictive man they'd never met. The letter was a stark reminder of the ripple effect of my actions. I hadn't just destroyed my own life, I had shattered countless others. For the first time since my arrest, the reality of my crime hit me in a way that even the courtroom hadn't. It wasn't just about me. It was about them, the people whose names I didn't know, whose faces I'd never see. And I had nearly killed them. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I let them fall, the weight of it all crushing me. I had thought I was the victim in all of this, the one who had been wronged. But I wasn't. I was the monster, the villain of the story. The letter stayed with me, folded neatly in my pocket, as the days dragged on. I read it over and over again, each time feeling the same stab of guilt and regret. It haunted me, even more than the divorce papers or the sentence itself. It was a constant reminder of the person I had become. And yet, as painful as it was, it also sparked something in me. A need to make things right, somehow. I couldn't undo what I had done, but maybe there was a way to atone. To at least try to make amends for the lives I had ruined. The next morning, I requested paper and a pen. It was time for me to write my own letter. Writing the letter wasn't easy. Every word felt like a burden, each sentence a reminder of the guilt I couldn't escape. But I needed to do it. I owed it to those people, the ones who had suffered because of me, to at least acknowledge the pain I caused. For once, this wasn't about me, it was about them. I sat at the small metal desk in my cell, staring at the blank sheet of paper. My hands trembled as I picked up the pen. The guard had given me a half-hour to write, but it felt like no amount of time would be enough to express the magnitude of what I had done. To the people I've hurt, I began, my heart pounding as I put the words to paper. I know nothing I say will ever be enough to make up for what I did. I poisoned you, physically, emotionally, and in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. There's no excuse for my actions. I let my anger control me, and in doing so, I lost sight of the fact that there were real people at the other end of my choices. I'm sorry. I know those words won't heal the wounds I've caused, but they're all I have. I'm truly sorry. The pen hovered over the paper for a moment as I tried to find the right words. It felt almost impossible to convey the depth of my regret. What I had done was more than just a mistake. It was a deliberate act of cruelty born from my own selfishness and rage. I've spent every day in this cell thinking about what happened. About the lives I've destroyed, the families I've torn apart. And I realize now that the pain I was trying to inflict on others came from my own failure. I wasn't strong enough to handle the betrayal, to face the reality of my own life falling apart. Instead, I chose to lash out, to make others suffer for my own misery. And that's something I'll live with for the rest of my life. I paused, the weight of my own words hitting me like a punch to the gut. I had thought that maybe, just maybe, putting it all down on paper would bring some kind of relief. But instead, it only deepened the sense of shame. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve it. But I needed to let you know that I'm not the man I was on that day. I'll never be able to undo the damage, but I will spend every day for the rest of my life trying to atone for it, even if that means nothing more than living with the consequences of my actions. If I could turn back time, I would. But I can't. All I can do now is say I'm sorry. I signed my name at the bottom, though it felt hollow, like the signature of a man who no longer existed. The John Harrison who sat here, broken and ashamed, wasn't the same man who had committed that crime. But that didn't change the fact that I was still responsible for it. I folded the letter and slipped it into the envelope the guard had provided. As I sealed it, a strange sense of finality washed over me. I had written it, but the words were out of my control now. Whether they would be read, ignored, or thrown away, I couldn't know. But I had taken the first step, and that had to count for something. When the guard came to collect the letter, I handed it over without a word. He nodded, slipping it into his pocket before walking away. As the door of my cell clanged shut, I leaned back on the cot, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginnings of it. Maybe, in time, I'd learn how to forgive myself, too. Months passed, and I settled into the slow, grinding routine of prison life. I worked in the library, sorting through old, worn-out books and occasionally helping inmates who could barely read. It was a small task, but it kept me busy. And in a place like this, busy was good. Busy meant less time for thinking, for drowning in the weight of my past. But the guilt never really left me. The letter I had written sat at the back of my mind, a reminder of the pain I had caused. I hadn't heard anything back. No one ever responded to letters like that. But I kept hoping, foolishly, that someone might. That someone out there would understand that I was trying, even if it wasn't enough. Then one day, a guard came to my cell with a message. "You've got a visitor," he said, his expression unreadable. I stared at him, caught off guard. No one had visited me since I'd been locked up. Who could it be? My mind raced as I followed him down the hall, toward the small, sterile visiting room. Part of me wondered if it was Laura. But no, she had made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with me. The divorce was final. Our lives were separate now. The guard opened the door, and I stepped inside. The room was small, with a single table and 2 chairs. On the other side of the table sat a woman, her face familiar yet unrecognizable at the same time. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a jolt of realization. She was one of them, one of the survivors. Her face was pale but determined, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She didn't speak right away, just looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like I was being weighed and judged. Finally, she broke the silence. "I got your letter," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I felt my throat tighten. You were at the festival? She nodded, her gaze unwavering. I was there. I drank the poison you put in the drinks. I opened my mouth to apologize, but the words felt useless. What could I say that would make any of this right? Nothing. There was nothing I could do to undo what I had done to her and to the others. I didn't come here for an apology, she said, as if reading my thoughts. I came here because I needed to see you. To look at the man who nearly killed me. Her words cut deep, but I nodded, respecting her need to confront me. I'm sorry, I managed to say. I know that doesn't mean much, but I need you to know how sorry I am. She was quiet for a moment as if considering whether or not to believe me. I've thought a lot about what happened, she finally said. About why you did it. I wanted to hate you, and part of me still does. But I also know that people do terrible things when they're in pain. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I didn't deserve her understanding, not after what I had done. But she was here, giving me a chance I hadn't expected. I'm not here to forgive you, she continued, her eyes piercing mine. I don't think I can. But I needed to know that you're not just the monster I've been imagining all this time. I needed to see that you're a person, too. Her words hit harder than any punch I had taken in prison. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I don't know what comes next for me, she said, standing up slowly. But I hope you spend the rest of your life trying to make up for what you did. She turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back at me one last time. You took something from me that day. Something I can't get back. But maybe, just maybe, you can find a way to be better than the man who did that. And with that, she was gone, leaving me alone in the cold, sterile room, her words echoing in my mind. After the visit, I was left with an unfamiliar feeling. A sliver of something that resembled hope, though I didn't quite know how to grasp it. Her words had stayed with me, haunting my every thought. Maybe you can find a way to be better than the man who did that. Could I? Was it even possible? I wasn't sure, but her visit planted a seed in me. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt like I had a reason to try. Days turned into weeks, and while the monotony of prison life continued, something had shifted. The conversations I had in my own head started changing. No longer was I obsessively replaying Laura's betrayal or Adam's smug face. Instead, I was thinking about the people at the festival, the survivors. The lives I had damaged. I couldn't change what I had done, but I needed to start facing the consequences in a way that went beyond just sitting behind bars. That's when the idea came to me. Small at first, fragile. But the more I thought about it, the more it began to take shape. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. I owed it to them, and maybe to myself. I spent days in the prison library, going through books, and asking the guards for access to legal materials. I needed to learn more about the victims, about how they were coping, and what kind of support they had. As I sifted through news articles, medical reports, and lawsuits, I realized that many of them were still struggling. The physical damage was one thing, but the emotional and psychological trauma was another entirely. I discovered that some of the survivors had filed lawsuits, not just against me but against the organizers of the festival, trying to get compensation for the medical bills that had piled up. Many of them hadn't been able to return to work. Some had lost their jobs and their homes. It was a ripple effect, one that kept expanding, long after that night had ended. It was overwhelming to take in, but it gave me direction. I had to do more than just sit in this cell, waiting for time to pass. I had to act. I requested a meeting with my lawyer, a woman I barely knew but who had dutifully represented me during the trial. When we sat down in the small meeting room, she looked at me with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. I want to set up a fund for the survivors, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Something to help them with their medical bills, or at least show them that I'm trying to make amends. She raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. John, you're in prison. You don't have any money. I know, I said quickly. But there has to be a way. I still have the house. Well, what's left of it? I want to sell it and liquidate everything I own. Whatever I get, I want it to go to them. She sat back in her chair, folding her arms. You're serious about this? I am. I don't know if it'll make a difference, but I have to try. I can't just sit here and do nothing. Not anymore. She regarded me for a long moment before nodding. I'll see what I can do. But don't expect miracles. This process could take a while, and even then, it might not be much. I understand, I said. I just need to do something. Blank. blank. The legal process was slow, as expected, but a few months later, the house was sold. It wasn't worth much, especially after everything that had happened, but it was enough to set up a small compensation fund. I knew it wouldn't fix anything, but it was something. A gesture, at least. The fund was anonymous. I didn't want my name attached to it. The survivors had suffered enough without having to be reminded of me. The media picked up on the story briefly. A small headline in the local paper: former detective behind music festival poisoning sets up victim fund. It didn't garner much attention, but that was fine by me. This wasn't about getting noticed. It was about doing the only thing I could think of to start paying back the debt I owed. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. I started receiving letters. At first, I thought they were from strangers, maybe people who had heard about the fund. But when I opened the first one, I froze. It was from one of the survivors. A man who had been hospitalized for weeks after the festival, his liver almost failing due to the poison. His words were short, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for what you did. But I got your money. It paid for my last hospital bill. I just wanted you to know that." I stared at the letter, my hands shaking. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. A connection to the people I had wronged, however small. More letters followed. Some were angry, others were indifferent. A few thanked me for the money, but none of them absolved me. I didn't expect them to. But the fact that they were writing at all meant that I had reached them in some way, even if only through a small act of compensation. One afternoon, as I sat at my usual spot in the library, sorting through old books, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't consumed by bitterness or regret. I wasn't a different man, maybe I never would be. But I was starting to come to terms with what I had done and what I needed to do to make amends, however long that took. The survivors might never forgive me. I might never forgive myself. But I had learned one thing: redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about facing it, owning it, and doing whatever you could to make things right, no matter how small the steps. And I would spend the rest of my life taking those steps, one by one. Time moved differently in prison. The days bled together in a haze of routine and reflection. But every now and then, something would crack the monotony. That crack came when I received a letter, one that I hadn't been expecting. It was from Laura. I stared at the envelope for what felt like hours, unable to bring myself to open it. It had been months since we last spoke, since the divorce was finalized. She hadn't been in touch since, and I convinced myself that we would never speak again. I was supposed to be okay with that. I had resigned myself to the fact that she had moved on with her life. Just like I was trying to move on with mine. But seeing her handwriting on that envelope brought everything back. The betrayal, the anger, the love we once had. Finally, I opened it, hands trembling slightly. The letter inside was brief and direct, just like Laura had always been. "John, I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if it matters anymore, but I wanted to reach out. I've been thinking about you lately. About everything that happened, and where we are now. I heard about the victim fund. I didn't know you had it in you, to be honest. But maybe I underestimated you. Maybe I never really understood what you were going through. I'm not writing to justify what I did. You and I both know that there's no way to excuse the affair. I hurt you, and I'll never be able to take that back. But I wanted to say that I'm sorry, not just for the affair, but for everything. For the way we drifted apart. For the way I stopped caring about us, about you. I thought I was searching for something better. But I was wrong. I realize now that we were both broken long before Adam came into the picture. He didn't break us. We did that ourselves. I'm not asking for forgiveness, John. I just wanted you to know that I've been thinking about you. And that despite everything, I hope you find peace. Wherever you are now, I hope you find a way to heal. Laura. I read the letter again, slowly this time, letting the words sink in. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me wanted to throw the letter away. To shut the door on that part of my life once and for all. But another part of me, perhaps the part that still cared about her, despite everything, wanted to hold on to it. She was right about one thing: we had broken long before the affair. We had stopped trying, stopped communicating, and it had left us vulnerable to the worst versions of ourselves. I had been so consumed by my work, by my need to control everything around me, that I hadn't seen her slipping away. And she, in her own way, had given up on me long before she ever found Adam. But knowing that didn't make the pain go away. It didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. And yet, for the first time, I felt something besides anger when I thought about Laura. I felt sadness, regret, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of understanding. I folded the letter and slipped it into the drawer next to my bed. I wasn't ready to forgive her. I wasn't sure I ever would be. But I was starting to understand that maybe forgiveness wasn't the goal. Maybe, like redemption, it was about facing the pain head on and learning how to live with it. Months passed, and the legal battles surrounding the festival finally began to wind down. The compensation fund had helped a few of the survivors, though it was clear that no amount of money could truly make up for what had happened. I continued to receive letters from survivors, some grateful, some angry, but all of them reminders of the consequences of my actions. And then, one morning, I got the news I had been waiting for and dreading. My lawyer came to see me, a rare visit, her expression as unreadable as ever. "John," she began, sitting across from me in the small, stuffy meeting room. "I've got some news about your case." I nodded, not sure what to expect. "The judge has agreed to a parole hearing." The words hit me like a shock. A parole hearing? After everything that had happened? I had been prepared to spend the rest of my life in this prison, paying for what I had done. But now, the possibility of freedom, something I hadn't even dared to dream of, was being put in front of me. "I thought you'd be excited," she said, studying my reaction. "I don't know if I deserve it," I admitted, my voice quiet. "Not after everything," she sighed, leaning forward. "Look, John, you've done what you can to make amends. You set up the fund, and you've taken responsibility for your actions. The system isn't about whether you deserve it. It's about whether you've shown enough to convince them that you're not a danger to society anymore." A danger. The word echoed in my mind. Was I still dangerous? Could I ever be trusted again? The parole hearing was set for 2 weeks later, and during that time, I found myself questioning everything. What would I do if they let me out? Where would I go? There was no home waiting for me, no family to return to. Laura had moved on with her life, and I couldn't imagine any of the friends I'd once had wanting anything to do with me after what I'd done. But more than that, I questioned whether I had really changed. Yes, I had set up the fund, and yes, I had begun to confront the reality of my actions. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I was a different man than the one who had committed that crime. The anger, the bitterness, it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, even if I was better at controlling it now. The day of the hearing arrived, and I found myself sitting in front of a panel of 3 judges, their expressions serious and dispassionate. My lawyer spoke on my behalf, detailing the steps I had taken to atone for my actions. The judges listened, their faces giving nothing away. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, my hands trembling slightly. I had rehearsed what I was going to say, but now that I was standing there, facing these people who held my fate in their hands, the words seemed to escape me. "I don't know if I deserve to be free," I began, my voice steady but quiet. "I'm not the same person I was when I committed that crime, but I also know that I'll never be able to undo what I did. I'll live with that for the rest of my life. But I've spent every day in here trying to make amends. Trying to figure out how to live with myself." I paused, searching their faces for any sign of what they were thinking, but they remained impassive. "If you let me out," I continued, "I don't know what my life will look like. I don't have any illusions about picking up where I left off. But I do know that I'll spend every day trying to be better than the man I was. That's all I can promise." The room was silent for a moment after I finished speaking. Then the judges exchanged glances. And one of them spoke. "We'll deliberate and inform you of our decision." With that, the hearing was over, and I was escorted back to my cell to wait. I didn't expect much. Part of me believed they would deny my parole, and in some ways, I thought that was what I deserved. But as the hours passed, I found myself hoping, despite everything, for a chance at redemption outside these walls. Finally, late in the evening, the guard came to my cell with the decision. "They granted it," he said. His voice gruff but not unkind. "You're getting out." I stared at him, not sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. After everything that had happened, I was being given a second chance. But as I lay down on the hard cot that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead of me. Freedom wasn't just about walking out of prison. It was about facing the world, and myself, with all the broken pieces still in hand. And that, I realized, might be the hardest thing of all. The day of my release felt surreal. I had spent so long behind those cold walls, the routines and the silence becoming my only reality, that the idea of stepping outside again felt almost foreign. As I gathered my few belongings, just a handful of books and letters, I kept wondering what was waiting for me on the other side of those gates. When the guards finally opened the heavy metal doors, I was greeted by a pale sky and the scent of damp earth. There was no one waiting for me. No family, no friends, no familiar faces to greet me as a free man. I had expected that, but it didn't make the emptiness feel any less crushing. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the weight of my own isolation. I didn't have a plan. I had nowhere to go, no home to return to. The few savings I had from the sale of my house had all gone to the victims' fund. I was walking out into the world with nothing but the clothes on my back and the ghosts of my past. I took a bus to a small town a few hours away from Falls Church. I couldn't go back there, not after everything that had happened. Too many memories, too many reminders of the life I had destroyed. The town I chose was quiet and unremarkable. A place where I could disappear, where no one would know my name or what I had done. I found a cheap room to rent in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The room was small, the paint peeling from the walls, the bed creaking under the weight of my body. But it was more space than I had had in years, and for now, it was enough. The first few days were strange. I spent most of my time walking, trying to clear my head, trying to figure out what came next. The streets were empty, the shops quiet, the people indifferent to the stranger in their midst. I liked it that way. No questions, no stares. Just silence. But the silence gave way to the familiar voices in my head, the voices of the victims, the survivors, the people I had hurt. The guilt was still there, gnawing at me, reminding me that freedom didn't erase the past. It only gave me the chance to live with it in a new way. One day, as I was walking past a small community center, I noticed a sign in the window. It was an advertisement for a volunteer program. They were looking for people to help at a local food bank. I stared at the sign for a long time, unsure if I was ready to be part of something again. But something about the idea of helping others, of doing something good for once, pulled me in. I walked inside, the sound of the bell above the door ringing softly. An older woman at the front desk looked up, her face kind but tired. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle. I saw the sign," I said, my voice shaky. "I'd like to volunteer." She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of warmth. "Great. We could use the help," she said, handing me a clipboard with a sign-up form. As I filled out the form, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't much, just a few hours a week, stacking shelves and handing out food to people in need. But it was something, a step toward rebuilding, toward making a difference in a way that didn't involve destruction. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, I started to find a rhythm. The people at the food bank didn't ask questions about my past. They didn't pry or judge. They simply accepted my help, and in return, I found a small sense of purpose again. But even as I tried to rebuild my life, the weight of what I had done lingered. I knew that no amount of volunteering or good deeds could ever fully atone for my crime. The victims would always carry the scars of that night, and so would I. One evening, after a long shift at the food bank, I returned to my motel room and found another letter waiting for me. My heart sank as I picked it up, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was from Laura. I hadn't heard from her since the last letter she sent in prison. I thought that part of my life was over. But as I opened the envelope, I realized that some things never really end. "John, I heard you were released. I don't know where you are now, but I wanted to reach out one last time. I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that happened. I don't know if there's any point in saying this, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I know that doesn't change anything, but I wanted you to know that I found a way to forgive myself for what I did. And I hope, in time, you can find a way to forgive yourself too. I'm not asking to be part of your life again. I just hope that, wherever you are, you can find some kind of peace. Laura." I stared at the letter for a long time, the words blurring in front of me. Forgive me. Could I ever do that? The idea felt impossible. But maybe, just maybe, Laura was right. Maybe that was the only way forward. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I would ever fully come to terms with my past. But I was out. I was free. And for the first time in years, I had the chance to decide what kind of man I wanted to be. As I lay down on the creaky bed, listening to the hum of the motel's broken air conditioner, I realized that I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know if I ever would. But I did know one thing, my story wasn't over yet. And as long as I was still breathing, I had the chance to write a different ending.